Hello, everybody. This is the program on constitutional government. I'm Harvey Mansfield, and our guest today is Joshua Katz, a linguist and a classicist. As he says, a linguist by training and a classicist by profession. He graduated from Yale, got an MPhil at Oxford, and a PhD at Harvard. He's presently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses, as again he says, on higher education, language and culture, the classical tradition, and the humanities in general. To describe him, I will quote the headline of an article he wrote in the Wall Street Journal. Princeton fed me to the cancel culture mob. And so that's his experience. That was on May 24th, 2022. So this is what has happened to him. He taught at Princeton from 1998 to 2022. He's written dozens of articles on linguistic issues in Homer, Virgil, Catullus, Hesiod, Horace, and others. He's written one called Exercises in Wile, and he knows many languages. Altogether, one could say he's a master of the recondite and of non-obvious significance in notable human speech. So the title of his talk is Names, Pronouns, and the Law. So Josh.
Thank you very much. You'll notice that Harvey just said, "So, Josh," and we're going to come to that in a moment. So look, it's great to be here. I'm thrilled to have been invited. I'm amazed that you would show up for this because I'm amazed that I'm here. I've given something like a dozen talks at Harvard over the years. They've been in the departments of linguistics and the classics and Celtic languages and literatures. But the Department of Government, I mean, what am I doing here? I don't know anything about government. I don't know anything about constitutional government. Well, but then I was thinking there actually are some reasons, and I give them in one on this very long handout, but I promise it's not as bad as it seems. I give you some reasons in number one why I'm giving a talk on names, pronouns, and the law. So first of all, that Harvard dissertation that Harvey mentioned was in fact about pronouns. Now, it was about pronouns in an entirely different sense from what people mean today when they talk about pronouns. I've written a lot about pronouns before, and these are highly technical discussions of Indo-European morphology, the sort of stuff that even a few years ago, even just a few years ago, I could talk to non-specialists about, and they would start laughing. You wrote your dissertation on pronouns? What an absurd thing that would be. Well, nobody is laughing anymore. And so I thought, well, let's expand my knowledge of pronouns and let me talk to you about that. The second personal interest that leads to this has to do with the second bullet point there. You'll see I have the word Josh and then three little thingies before the word Joshua. This is because despite my best efforts to get people to call me Joshua, they invariably call me Josh. More on that later on. Here is an example in point, not set up. And this makes me slightly cross and makes me therefore interested in names. Third, in 2020, in addition to being attacked for all sorts of other things, I was attacked for unintentionally misgendering someone, which then got me interested in what that might mean. And last but not least, the law, about which I know less than about both names and pronouns. Well, you can't have had what happened to me happen in the past couple of years and not be interested in the law. So here we go. Let me start with names. So everybody knows, this is number two on the handout, everybody knows that names are not like normal nouns. So if, for example, I want to talk about a daisy, I can use the word daisy, or if I want to talk about the word basket, I can use the word basket, and all of us have more or less the same understanding of what these nouns mean. And If I decide to call a basket a daisy or a daisy a basket, that's going to be a real problem because I'm going to do this inappropriately and you're going to say that this is a problem. But what about names? So let's just take, for example, the name Peter. If I use the name, well, hello, Peter. If I use the name Peter, am I referring, okay, good, we've got two of them, great. Am I referring to you? Am I referring to you? Am I referring to the Apostle Simon Peter? Am I referring to Peter Paul Rubens? Am I referring to Peter Thiel? What does this mean? Am I referring to my one cousin Peter or my other cousin Peter? And more broadly then, is there some notion, you probably think not, I probably think not, of Peterhood, right? The way there's some notion of daisyhood or baskethood. Well, what do we know about names and meaning? So there are plenty of cultures in the world in which names regularly have meaning. This is now 2-2 on the handout. Ours is not such a culture, although it's not totally uncommon for names to have, quote, meaning, especially, I should say, female names. So Faith or Hope, or the daughter of Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin, who is called Apple. Take, for example, Daisy as in Daisy Buchanan, as in The Great Gatsby. So when you think about the character Daisy Buchanan, it seems to me likely that fleetingly somewhere you imagine daisies. I'm not going to insist on this, but it would not be surprising if at some point in the course of reading this book you think, oh, Daisy Buchanan, oh, here's a flower. Now, Daisy is married to Tom Buchanan. That's short for Thomas, and the name Thomas goes back to the Aramaic word for twin. I am entirely confident that there is nobody in the world, I include professors of Aramaic at Harvard, who read The Great Gatsby and when they read about Tom Buchanan, think about twins. There's obviously a difference between Daisy and Tom in this sense, and whether you think of a name like Peter as having to do with the rock, like the first pope, presumably depends at least to some extent on whether you are Catholic or high Catholic or not. And of course we could go even deeper, just to make a little comment that only linguists will really appreciate. The word daisy 1,000 years ago was not a word, it was a collocation, deus ea, which meant something like the day's eye. But once again, when you think of either daisies or of Daisy Buchanan, you don't think about that sort of thing. So that's a little prelude about names. But now, 3 on the handout, let me discuss what I consider to be a nominal problem. And I mean nominal here in 2 senses. The one is nominal as in having to do with nouns, and the other nominal as in maybe it's not actually all that important. So first things first, and this is going to get back to the whole Joshua-Josh question. I view it as a basic courtesy to try to get people's names right. So let's take the vice president. I am no fan of the vice president, but the fact is that when people who have heard her first name hundreds and hundreds of times insist on putting the emphasis on the second syllable and saying Kamala, I find that really annoying. It just seems to me fundamentally rude. Is it a microaggression? Is it a macroaggression? Is it an aggression? Well, I guess that depends on what one thinks about microaggressions. So, for example, I don't know, I don't think people should be censured for saying, for example, America is a melting pot. And I don't really think people should be censured for saying Kamala, but it does seem to me fundamentally rude. And that's because, and you'll see here in the fine print on the handout, I have a few sentences here in parentheses with quotation marks. There's a reason for this. Pay attention to these sentences. My feeling about this is I have no trouble understanding why a person would wish for his or her personal name to be pronounced more or less correctly. But I want to emphasize more or less. So if, for example, you are, and here is another sentence, an American called Harry, and an Italian calls you Ari, because Italian doesn't have the initial sound H. It seems to me that if you object, you're just being sort of ridiculous. As I write here, when a reasonable American named Harry hears an Italian call him Ari, he will smile rather than object. Or take, for example, the German name Michael, spelled exactly the same way Michael is in English. If you're a German and you're called Michael and an American comes up to you and says, "Hi, Michael," once again, there's a reason for this. It's not what I would call a particular aggression, so probably you should just smile rather than object. But Kamala, that's a sort of different question. It's not as though there's some interference that I know of the Harry, Ari, Michael, Michael type. And besides, it's very similar to, say, the name Pamela. And as far as I know, speakers of English are not routinely going around saying Pamela or anything like that instead. So there's every reason to think within English that people ought to say this correctly. Then there's the case of Josh. I could go on about this forever. Needless to say, I'm not going to, although at some point I'm going to write a paper about why it is that Josh is different from Pam and Mike and all of those other shortenings. It is a fact, this really is a fact, that over 90% of the time, if I say to somebody, "Hi, I'm Joshua," the response is, "Nice to meet you, Josh." It happens almost every time. This doesn't happen with Pamelas and Pams and Michaels and Mikes. It's completely off the charts, and there actually is a linguistic reason for it, which I'm not going to get into now. It's crazy. I can talk to lawyers, I can talk to doctors, I can get official letters from the government. Josh, 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 completely crazy. I find this annoying. Is that illegal? Well, we'll come back to that. Let me tell you a little more about my family. My wife's name is Solveig, S-O-L-V-E-I-G. She is half of Norwegian heritage. The G at the end is silent. If you are not of Scandinavian heritage, you are unlikely to say her name correctly. And indeed, a few years ago, we went to her ancestral country of Norway, where she was horrified to discover that her name there isn't Solveig, it's Solveig, which meant that she's pronouncing her name incorrectly from that point of view. Okay, this is a rabbit hole. We could go down this forever. She doesn't really care, though, what people say. But her mother, one last sentence on the handout here, her mother, my mother-in-law, is K-A-R-I, pronounced Kari. Do not call her Carrie. She really does care. And last, I just have to mention my mother, whose name is Meta. Her mother was also called Meta. Her mother's mother was also called Meta. Thank God we're at the end of that problem and that I was not a girl. And this is a perfectly fine name, except that people mispronounce it. They say Meta, they say Meda, they say Mida. And as of last year, when Facebook decided to change its name, her name is absolutely everywhere. And so all I do every day is read headlines like, Meta rolls out more parental controls, which even at my age I find extremely alarming. Okay, enough of all that. Let me be serious here and talk about not a nominal problem, but in number 4 on the handout, a pronominal problem. So these sentences that I've uttered, let me ring some changes on them. 4.1, number 1. Listen closely, or read closely. When a reasonable American named Harry hears an Italian call her Ari, she will smile rather than object. Or, my mother-in-law is Kari, pronounced Kari. Do not call him Carrie. He does care. You're unlikely, I think, to be able to process these. There is, after all, a reason that J.K. Rowling called Harry Harry and not, say, Hermione. You're unlikely to be able to process.
J.K. Rowling.
Okay. Oh, you're of course right.
How many times have you heard the name Josh?
There is a question here of whether if you're a public figure like that, could she sue me? Could she sue me as opposed to some minor figure for that? Okay, I will make that mistake again because people do make mistakes. But it was unintentional, and we will also come back to the question of intention. So I'm a bad boy, but it was unintentional. I was not meaning to offend her. Fair enough. Okay, so look, these sentences 1 and 2 are, I think, very, very difficult to process. But, well, first of all, maybe Harry has a penis but identifies as a woman. Okay, this is not the sort of sentence that a few years ago I would have uttered, but these days seems to be a perfectly real thing. And then there's the second one about my mother-in-law. I would say clearly, sentence 2 there, my mother-in-law is Kari, do not call him Carrie, he does care. I would say that clearly that one is unintelligible because after all, I have introduced her as my wife's mother, but then again Apple, by which I mean the company, not the daughter of Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin, last year put out the emoji, which you can barely perhaps see on the handout, of the pregnant man. So things have become a little bit more complicated. Let's ring some more changes. 4.2. Number 1, when a reasonable American named Harry hears an Italian call them Ari, they will smile rather than object. Number 2, my mother-in-law is Kari, pronounced Kari. Do not call them Carrie. They do care. And number 3, I have no trouble understanding why a person would wish for their personal name to be pronounced more or less correctly. Now, I am linguistically very conservative for my age, for my generation. And I am not particularly fond of the thing at the bottom of the handout, namely generic singular they. But I know that I use it, and indeed there are advantages to using it. This is not the moment for me to go into the advantages and the disadvantages of it, but that third sentence is not likely to strike most of you as bizarre, and most of you I think will probably think it's pretty good. After all, the generic singular they has advantages over the clunky his or her. It avoids the sexism of imagining that some person you don't know is necessarily male, or for that matter female, and sometimes indeed it truly would, I quote Brian Garner here, be deranged not to use that they. But this is very different from the they in those first two sentences. Sentences like, my mother-in-law is Kari, do not call them Carrie, they do care. Those are they as gendered singulars, with Harry and Kari specifically identified as gender non-binary or non-conforming. And you may recall that in 2019, or if you're a linguist, you won't have to recall, you will know this, that in 2019, Merriam-Webster Incorporated, who run a major dictionary, called that they the word of the year, and I don't need to tell all of you that in elite circles it is increasingly recommended and in some cases even mandated that people use this. For many Americans outside those elite circles, this is somewhere between ridiculous and dangerous, so we have a real problem here. So what I want to do now is go through a couple of questions, things I want you to think about in the time ahead. What are the practical, moral, linguistic, and above all legal similarities and differences between names, Latin nomina, and pronouns, Latin pronomina, literally in place of nomina? What are the relationships, if any, between names and pronouns? And what is the relationship between assigning names and assigning pronouns? So let's talk about assigning names in number 5. Everybody agrees, I think there's no dispute at all, that children are in all but extremely unusual cases given their names, assigned their names by their parents, and furthermore that parents have considerable latitude in determining what those names are. Now, different states have different onomastic rules, not to mention different countries, but by and large, the First and 14th Amendments are taken to mean that parents have the right to do pretty much whatever they want. There are some exceptions. In some states, many states, you can't name your child an obscenity. There are also practical matters. So some states mandate that the length has to be under, I'm now going to make up a number, but 250 characters or something like that. It appears to be the case, although as far as I know nobody's tested it, that in Kentucky you can do anything you want. But in most states there are some regulations, but they're very minor things. Well, not entirely. So in California, for example, you cannot use diacritical marks. This means, by the way, that you cannot call your kid Jose with an accent in California. That is extremely odd, and I have to say, not something that I approve of. In California, you have to use the standard 26 letters. You cannot use Arabic numerals. You cannot use pictographs. You cannot name your kid a smiley face. And this came to people's attention in 2020 when the son of Elon Musk and Grimes was born and was assigned the given name X, AE ligature, A-12 by his parents, which hyphens, it turns out, are allowed in California, but you can't have 1-2 and you can't have an AE ligature. And so Elon Musk and Grimes were forced to change the name of their child to XAEA-XII. They moved, of course, to Texas the following year, but even had the kid been born in Texas, it wouldn't have mattered because Texas has the same rules as California in this particular instance. Okay, now we're going to get to another child of Elon Musk in a second, because let's talk about reassigning names. 5.2, people are permitted to change their last name when they get married. I think everybody agrees with that, and pretty much everybody will say that when you reach the age of majority, or in some cases even earlier, you may legally change your first and other given names. Different states have slightly different rules, but fundamentally, unless the reason to change your name is to engage in criminal activity like fraud, you're allowed to do pretty much whatever you want. So for example, in 2004, Elon Musk had a child with his ex-wife, Justine Wilson. This child turned 18 earlier this year. This child was originally called Xavier Musk, but has now successfully petitioned the court to be called Vivian Jenna Wilson. Now, there are countries in which this would not be allowed. In Denmark, for example, you cannot use a conventionally female name for a male or a conventionally male name for a female. But I think it's fair to say that most Americans won't object to this. You might think it's stupid. You might not approve of it, but you're unlikely, I think, to think that that should be illegal. The real controversy is not the change of Xavier to Vivian so much as the other thing that that child, well, no longer child, petitioned the courts to do, namely to change gender from male to female. And this brings us then to 6, questions of assigning sex and assigning gender, and the question of whether these can even be assigned. So 2 big questions in 6.1. First, should people be allowed to change, that is to say, reassign their gender? And, you know, to answer this, we have to know what gender is. You can see that that's going to be a problem. And you're going to have to agree that gender is in fact changeable. And then there's the other question, what do we mean by assignment? So 6.2, back to names just for a second. We grant that parents may assign names, but there's nothing about any newborn baby that demands that he or she be given the name Peter or Daisy. Sorry, guys, that's just the way it is. We also grant that once babies named Peter and Daisy can decide to call themselves Pete and Days, or to go by their middle names, or for that matter, ask, though probably not demand, that others call them, say, Jack and Jill. And now I put a word, a very important word on the handout in bold, respectively. So Peter can ask, though seemingly not demand, that people call him Jack, and Daisy can ask, but presumably not demand, that people call her Jill. But it seems to be the case, we'll come back to this, that if Peter wishes to become Jill and Daisy to become Jack, then they may actually be able to demand this. This is a rather interesting point. More on that in a few minutes. And furthermore, I'm just repeating what's already been said, once babies may, at some point in their lives, not only call themselves by a different name from the one that their parents assigned to them, but actually legally change it. So 6.3, what is sex, what is gender, and who has responsibility for assignment? Well, this is being recorded too. Every single day is going to give different answers. There are vituperative op-eds, news stories, videos, political ads out there every single day with people giving entirely contradictory answers to these questions. So it makes it essentially impossible, and I think this is now legally interesting, essentially impossible for anybody to deal with these questions in the current environment even-handedly, because first of all, the meanings are obviously labile, and on top of that, it's just impossible for one's own feelings and predilections not to enter into how one answers these questions. And we're in such a mess, I think, in 2022, this is the bottom of page 4, that the old liberal mantra, sex is biological, gender is social, is now sometimes turned around. So Lior Sapir, who's going to be talking in this seminar, I believe, in a month, and is writing phenomenal things on these subjects, pointed out in a recent piece in City Journal that, quote, according to this new progressive anthropology, biological sex is a social construct, while gender identity is real, universal, and scientifically demonstrable. These two views are entirely incompatible with each other. So, boy, that's a real mess. So what did I say? I said one has to have one's own predilections into this. There's nothing to be done. So let me just say up front what my view is, and we can, of course, argue about this if you want. Number one, despite rabid arguments to the contrary, sex is not changeable and thus cannot be assigned. It just is. And second, there are two and only two sexes, male and female. There is no spectrum. What about gender? Well, to ask that question is to subscribe to some notion of dualism. Because if there's no difference between sex and gender, then whatever you think sex is has to also be what gender is. There's nothing more to say about this question. But suppose that you are So if, for example, you're anti-dualistic, that is to say, if you believe that one's body is an intrinsic and essential part of one's personhood rather than something extrinsic and incidental, then denial of bodily unity is a sign of mental illness. So there's no point in even asking about gender because whatever it is the same as sex. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is a difference between sex and gender. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that there are biological males who legitimately believe, emphasis on legitimately, of course, that they are in some sense female, biological females who legitimately believe that they are in some sense male, and individuals who legitimately believe that they're neither male nor female, but are instead in some sense both or neither. So, two questions. What do you mean by in some sense? And, of course, suppose there's a conflict. If there's a conflict between sex and gender, which one wins? Does sex trump gender, or does gender trump sex? So let me make some comments about both of these. First of all, in some sense. I'm in some sense male, I'm in some sense female, I'm in some sense neither or both. The fact is that definitions vary these days from person to person and within a person from day to day, in part because there's disagreement over whether gender means gender identity, gender expression, or some combination of the two in some as yet unagreed on proportion. And here are two what I'll call monsters of gender ideology. Let's look at these monsters. The one is the gender-bred person. The gender-bred person has existed in various versions over the years, is now in version 4.0. It is unlikely that you've never seen the gender-bred person, especially if you have children. There's also now the gender unicorn, which is supposedly an improvement over the gender person. The gender unicorn is a very elaborate purple creature which has mapped onto it gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, and emotional attraction. Oh, and by the way, also sex assigned at birth. These are all mapped onto this purple creature. You can see that things are very, very, very complicated. And, well, there's only so much one can say about representational baked goods and mythic creatures. Let's actually turn to the real world. 6.3, as you all know, in 2020, the Supreme Court issued a decision on Bostock versus Clayton County. I should leave to others deep thoughts about this, but everybody knows that Justice Gorsuch's view of transgenderism, I'm going to leave aside for today his view in that case on sexual orientation, but everybody knows that his view of transgenderism there was that sex, the word, in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and thus presumably the word sex in over 160 further federal statutes, which Justice Alito helpfully lists in Appendix C of his dissent, that the word sex there has to include gender. But, you know, aside from what Alito called the pirate ship textualism and usurpation of legislative authority exhibited by the majority, there's the very real problem that without a plausible and stable understanding of gender, which we clearly do not have, I mean, it may be plausible, but it is emphatically not stable, for this reason alone, there are going to be lawsuits about this that go well beyond employment law and Bostock, bathrooms, sports teams, pronouns, dead names, till kingdom come. And these suits, by the way, are going to come from the left as well as from the right, for one thing, because Bostock only involves moves from male to female and female to male. The words non-binary and genderqueer go unmentioned in those 168 pages of opinion and dissents, and so people have already started talking about, well, what does that mean? Then there's that second question, this is now 6.6 that I mentioned before, priority. Supposing that we grant that there is a difference between sex and gender and yet create laws that cover both at the same time, what matters in a given situation? You all know questions like, should biological males compete in women's sports if they identify as, that is to say, assign themselves to be female? Should such biological males be housed in women's shelters and prisons? What are society's obligations to those who refuse to call themselves either male or female, or who call themselves male one day, female the next day, and then male again after that? And critically, to come to my question, should biological females who identify as, that is to say, who assign themselves to be male, be addressed with masculine pronouns? Should biological males who identify as females be addressed with feminine pronouns? And should individuals who identify as neither or both be addressed as they or zer or whatever pleases them at a given moment? Once again, a question of rhetoric. What does should mean? Is this a legal obligation? Is it legally required to address people according to their wishes? Or is this not a legal obligation, but let's say a moral one? If you're not a dualist, then you're going to be strongly inclined to call Vivian Jenna, remember Vivian Jenna, whether or not you use that name or Xavier, you're going to be strongly inclined to use the pronouns he, him, and his, and that can get you into trouble. But conversely, if you have any dualist sympathies at all, and I do have some dualist sympathies, then you're going to be torn. Do you want to be truthful, or do you want to be what counts these days as civil? And of course, if you're torn, then you can get into trouble too. So both for the dualists and the non-dualists, there's a problem here. So here, in a sentence, is what I think. When it comes to the law, and we're about to get to the law to conclude, when it comes to the law, I believe sex is what matters, unless and until there is a generally accepted understanding of gender, and unless there is reason to believe that this concept of gender is in fact more important than sex. So, the law. As far as I can tell, this is 7.1, and this is something that really astounds me. As far as I can tell, there is no case law on misnaming people except in the context of trans rights. So this brings us back to the stuff at the very beginning when I was talking about Josh and Kamala and so on. The courts have, as far as I know, not ruled on whether it constitutes harassment repeatedly to call Kamala Kamala, or Joshua Josh, or Peter Simon, or say any of us Chattanooga. My feeling is that these again are nominal problems. That is to say, they probably don't matter very much. And this seems to be the view of the EEOC. The EEOC under harassment. Petty slights, annoyances, and isolated incidents, unless extremely serious, will not rise to the level of illegality. To be unlawful, the conduct must create a work environment that would be intimidating, hostile, or offensive to reasonable people. Still, it's not impossible to think that courts will soon decide that at least some mispronunciations are, in fact, harassment. So in 2008, there was a case, EEOC versus Blockbuster, in which the former video giant was found to have engaged in racial discrimination against a Bangladeshi employee by, among other things, asking her to change her name because the customers could not pronounce it. Now, what about trans rights? So here is a quotation from the EEOC again. This is in a different section, and it's very similar to what we just saw, but it's more ominously phrased. Quote, although accidental misuse of a transgender employee's preferred name and pronouns does not violate Title VII, intentionally and repeatedly using the wrong name and pronouns to refer to a transgender employee could contribute to an unlawful, hostile work environment. Well, a case, Lusardi versus the Army in 2015, an EEOC case, has set banana peels on the ground for this sort of problem. Because in this case, the Army was found liable for subjecting complainant, who was a transgender woman, to a hostile work environment based on sex by allowing a team leader intentionally and repeatedly to refer to her by male names and pronouns well after he was aware that complainant's gender identity was female. So again, I keep having two sets of questions. Here in 7.3 are two sets of questions to think about. One, if someone of good faith is not a dualist or has doubts about dualism, or even is a dualist but thinks it's sex that matters, or if someone simply refuses to engage in compelled speech, or if someone holds the sincerely held religious belief that male and female created he, them, can he or she really run afoul of civil rights law, especially at a time when the panoply of so-called neo-pronouns is enormous and growing? Just a very few examples there on the handout. When some people change their pronouns willy-nilly, and when it's unclear what is even meant by gender, never mind then transgender. And the second question, which I think has not really been asked, can it really be the case that it is illegal to use a dispreferred name only when talking to and about transgender people? I have to say, I'm skeptical that this should be illegal for anyone, but if intent matters, and if intentionally doing this is illegal for some people, then shouldn't it be illegal for everyone? Well, 7.4, here are some live issues, especially after Bostock. As you all know, I think, Justice Alito, in his dissent, worrying about the implications for freedom of speech, wrote, after today's decision, plaintiffs may claim that the failure to use their preferred pronoun violates one of the federal laws prohibiting sex discrimination. There are endless examples. I'll just give you three sets, a governmental one, a quasi-governmental one in the sense of schools, and Fair Harvard. So current laws exist across the country, from New York City to California, that you are liable if you engage in misnaming or make pronominal errors. Students in Virginia in the Fairfax County Public Schools have, quote, the right to be called by chosen names and pronouns. And as you all in this room may be aware, at Harvard, current undergraduates are being given official notice in mandatory training that the use of, quote, wrong pronouns is a form of, quote, abuse. So we've been talking about names and pronouns. Are names and pronouns the same in some sense or different? Well, here's just a quick linguistic overview. Words in a given language typically belong to one of two classes. open class words, that is to say words, categories of words that routinely accept new words, and closed class words, ones that very rarely accept new words. And there are differences among languages, but nouns are always open class. You can add new ones, while pronouns are closed class. Personal names, it's disputed. Some people think that they're open, some people think they're closed, and frankly, the disputes are very, very recondite. So I'll say just for the moment this, that if names and pronouns belong to the same class, that would be closed, then that might be a reason to treat them in the same way for extralinguistic, like say, legal purposes. But if names and pronouns belong to different classes, then at least from the perspective of a linguist, there's at least one reason to believe that they, not to believe that they have the same legal status. Different languages do different things. Different languages have different pronominal systems. And even within a given system, there's always change. Pronouns change in sound. For example, the word you goes back to Proto-Germanic iswiz, and that's what I wrote that Harvard dissertation about a quarter of a century ago. And you see people laugh because that's funny, unlike stuff about, say, zur, which is no longer funny at all. But we don't really care about sound. Okay, there's also meaning. Pronouns change their scope and meaning over time, but so do all words. Let's just take a case of you. You in Standard English has taken over the meaning of thou and thee, which most of us don't use. But what's really important is that closed class words, including pronouns, can be added, and for that matter subtracted. It's just not very common. So for example, there are successful neo-pronouns in dialects of English that nobody here objects to, though some of us may think, well, that's a funny dialect. We have dialects like y'all and yins and yous guys, which have taken over the plural function of you, and in those dialects, our friend you, which had taken over the meaning of thou, now effectively means thou. So pronouns can change, and that's something that we should then want to talk about. But it's recently become clear, and I think this is quite sensible, that legally pronouns and names may really be different. So in 2021 in the Sixth Circuit, there was Merriweather versus Hartop. Merriweather is a professor of philosophy at Shawnee State University. And he sued his university for infringement of First Amendment rights when Shawnee State disciplined him for refusing to use the pronouns she, her, hers for a transgender student. The case was concluded favorably, with a settlement favorable to Merriweather this past April. So here's what Merriweather himself wrote in 2020 about this. So why not simply call students what they wish to be called? I was willing to do so with this student and with any student who asks me to. His chosen name, though not his birth name, is feminine, and I was willing to call him this since using a person's proper name doesn't imply anything about what one believes or what is true. He goes on, what I cannot do, however, is speak in such a way that implies that a man is a woman or a woman is a man. In other words, refer to a student, he's thinking here about pronouns, in such a way that I imply something that is not true. And we have a very recent case in Utah, Richard Bugg, professor of theater at Southern Utah University, who's suing for retaliation by his employer after he refused to use they, them, their for a non-binary student. He offered instead to use the student's given or preferred name, but by his own admission 2 or 3 times he accidentally used female pronouns, and that student then reported him to the administration, and he is in trouble. Interestingly, I don't think this is going to fly, but interestingly, this is in the fine print on the bottom of page 9, he didn't want to use plural pronouns because he believed they were grammatically incorrect. There's an interesting little legal question here of whether you can make a claim like that successfully. Now, FIRE, the started by my friend Harvey, the other Harvey over here, right? We have Peter, Peter, Harvey, and Harvey. Well, Fire is on this case, quote, where professors can find reasonable alternatives to using a student's preferred pronouns, such as using the student's preferred name instead, as Bug did, their college must allow for that reasonable accommodation. The use of preferred and non-binary gender pronouns is a matter of active public debate. Yes, it is. And people have differing opinions on gender and gender expression. Indeed, they do. Compelling speech to align with a particularized viewpoint violates fundamental values of free speech and private conscience. And now here's where it gets interesting, I think. Describing an individual with pronouns that the individual finds offensive can be a part of a pattern of unlawful harassment or discrimination, but professors should not be punished for accidentally using a student's incorrect pronouns, nor would the law on discrimination and harassment require they be punished. What counts as accidental, what counts as a requirement, and what does can be mean? Final comments. It turns out that the fullest accounts on all of these things come from the progressive left, indeed often from the very far left. So if you want to know about the law, you should read this very long and very detailed paper that appeared late last year in the California Law Review, a paper called Misgendering by John Tove McNamara. This article is extremely useful, but it makes clear up front what the author's views are, and you have to be careful. So for example, McNamara writes, indeed, a look to employment discrimination case law provides a snapshot of how frequently nominal mispronunciation has been used to verbally harass minority employees. And to this claim, there is a lengthy footnote that gives 6 cases, and it calls these cases exempli gratia, implying that there are more. But what McNamara does not even hint at is that in not one of these 6 cases was the ruling in favor of the plaintiff. So back to my comment that there is in fact no clear case law on this sort of thing. And then there's Dennis Barron, who's a very distinguished linguist. There's his book, What's Your Pronoun? Beyond He and She, which came out in 2020. Barron, too, is a man of the left. There's a great deal to recommend in this book, but the pages called Pushing Back Against Pronoun Choice are contentious and, well, I'm legally unsophisticated, so I can't really complain, but they seem to me legally unsophisticated too. For example, he writes, official support for non-binary pronouns is no different from rules against the use of racial, ethnic, or religious slurs, swearing, or harassment. That's a very contentious statement, and I don't know how many people here and elsewhere would agree with that. And he ends that section with, I think, this very interesting sentence. Using such words in the workplace may not be illegal, and it is not unconstitutional, but it may be in poor taste, and it can still get you fired. So why have I given this talk? I've given this talk because, as far as I can tell, people on the center and to the right have not yet commented sufficiently on the status of names and the law and the status of pronouns and the law. So here's a taste, and let's discuss.
Catherine and then Harvey.
Okay, I have 2 questions. The first one's probably quick. Are there languages, do you know of any languages that don't have male-female pronouns? I know that there's neuter along with male and female.
Yes. So actually, I realized, and I put in a little clause there, but I actually realized this morning as I was coming over here that I didn't have an obvious point on the handout talking about how other languages work. The short answer is yes, there are all kinds of systems of pronouns out there, and that actually is a very important point. I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm annoyed at myself for not having put a section of that on the handout. So the fact that English behaves in a certain way, even right now, never mind across time, does not mean that God made English and that's the way everything has to be. There are unquestionably other systems out there, and there are systems out there that people who want to emphasize trans rights, I think perfectly understandably, talk about, because there are other systems that do these things very differently from the way English does. So then the question is, how much should we care about that? It's a little bit like how much should we care about, say, foreign law, right? People are going to have different views on this. But yes, I should have had a section on this, and it would be hard to comment coherently and succinctly right now, but it's a very important point to understand that English is not the be-all and end-all. There are other systems out there, and of course other systems are going to make the people who use those systems, and potentially even other people, have different points of view.
English has Shakespeare.
English does have Shakespeare, who, by the way, used they as a singular.
Right? And it does, is there any language that doesn't have pronouns?
No, there is no language that doesn't have pronouns.
My other question, but this might be cheating to slip in a second one, but
Sure.
could you just say a little bit more about the history of the use of the word gender when it became popular?
Right. No. So I wish I could do that. I should be prepared for that question, and I'm not.
It's fine. I can look it up.
Well, it's hard to look up. I mean, of course, you can look it up in the OED, and it will tell you various things. But what's very, very hard to get from this is just how different people's conceptions of that word are. So it's one thing, and I should have a ready answer to this, and I apologize for not having it. It's one thing to figure out when first gender as something distinct from sex was used and then popularized. I'm sure it was popularized well after it was first used, but I don't remember when it was first used, and I should. But that's only part one of the question. Part two is having decided that there is something called gender which is different from sex, then what is that gender? And you can believe anything, you can have any views you like on whether what I've just said is really good or really horrible, but you cannot deny that people have entirely different points of view right now on what actually gender is and what it constitutes and what the important aspects of it are.
Can I just a follow-up question on whether there's a language without pronouns?
Yep.
What makes it necessary to have pronouns, would you say? Such that everybody does it. Couldn't you just repeat Peter?
You could, of course, do that. Repetition is, of course, a very interesting thing in languages. There are forms of repetition that we really like, and there are forms of repetition that we really don't like. You can repeat things, and your editor will say, "Oh, come on, stop using the same word over and over again." Or you can repeat things, and it's a wonderful stylistic feature. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. Right? So, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't have some deep answer to why it is that people don't like saying Harvey, 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 but they don't.
Yeah.
Maybe if it were poetic, maybe if every single time one mentioned Harvey, it had the cadences of Dickens, then it would be okay, but that would be hard to pull off.
Okay.
I have a very quick follow-up to Catherine's question. Have you heard that the distinction between sex and gender, I've read this, but I have no idea whether this is true, actually originated within the sciences when they became more popular, because sex is the same as having sex.
Having sex.
Sexual act, and so, in order not to speak about basically
Yes.
having sex all
Yes.
the time, the term gender was used in the 19th century already.
Yes. So so what I don't now know is the chronology here, but it is certainly true that one reason that people started using gender was in order not to have the laughter of using sex, because sex meant, well, sex. That's right. What I don't know now is the chronology, but that is part of the story is absolutely clear.
So we can blame conservatives and religious people or gender?
I think that is probably partly true, yes.
Does anyone speak of having gender?
I wouldn't,
What gender does that noun take in Spanish?
yes, but I think this is a different question. Not in my circles,
I see.
but perhaps in others.
Right. Did you have a question?
Yes, I'm a lawyer.
This is Harvey
I
Silverglade.
toward the practical.
Indeed.
And my question is, I have a lot of disciplinary cases in universities representing students and even faculty members. My question is, when did it become the business of a dean of students what one student called another? Isn't that, in a free society, the typical kind of thing people work out for themselves? When I was in Princeton's class of '64.
Indeed.
And there were very few Jews in my class. Even few of them were Jews from Brooklyn. I was in a very small category. And it was not unusual.
We can hear that.
Huh?
We can hear that.
And it was not unusual for somebody, 52% of the members of my class was south of the Mason-Dixon line. And it wasn't unusual for somebody to call me a kike.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of my going to the dean of students to complain about this was completely foreign. And if I did, the dean would say, "Did he punch you in the nose? When
Correct.
he punches you in the nose, come back to me. Otherwise, you work it out with
Yes.
him, you know." And that's how I got through 4 years in what's now would be called a hostile environment.
Indeed.
And I didn't consider it a hostile environment. I was getting a good education. I was on a full scholarship. And what did I care about what some cracker called me from Georgia?
Yeah.
So how did that change? When did that change?
Well, you're of course asking me a question that you can answer better yourself than I can. But
I'm interested in your view as to how and when it happened that one of these, tin pot Napoleon deans suddenly decided to became the language police.
Sure. Well, I guess the way I would start to answer the question is this. I started at Princeton in 1998. 1998 is a considerable distance from 1964. But in 1998 and 1999 and 2000, I think I knew every single member of the Princeton administration. That is to say, there weren't dozens and dozens and dozens of tin pot deanlets running around. There simply weren't. So if you had a problem, you knew exactly which person to go to, not because that person was the vice president for San Pellegrino and this other person was the vice president for potato chips, but because there were a very few jobs and they were and the things that these people did was distributed according to principles that every normal person could understand. So the idea that you would go to one of the high-ranking officials, because being a dean meant something in those days, to complain about something that at that point virtually everybody would have called a triviality. Words were not yet violence. Silence was not yet violence. Violence was violence. That was a different question. People wouldn't do that. It just didn't happen even then. So, of course, many things happened between 1964 and 1998, but in my experience, this sort of thing is really a much more recent phenomenon. Nobody would have done this. No sensible person would have done this or received the sorts of responses that you would get today when I started at Princeton.
There's a chicken egg problem. I'm running as a petition candidate for the Harvard Board of Overseers on a free speech platform and due process, but I'm also, one of the things on my platform is going to be to fire 95% of the administrators. Because if you did, they're useless, right? If you
They're much worse than useless. They're pernicious.
Right.
Useless is one thing. Useless is just a waste of money. These people are actually causing harm.
Yeah. But if you got rid of them, they would have to get rid of some of these codes and words because there wouldn't be people to enforce them.
Well, yes, but of course now we get to the law. Some of the reason there's this administrative bloat is because it's federally mandated. Right? So there are certain people you probably can't easily get rid of because of idiotic federal laws. There are others who exist only inside a given universe, like the Princeton Orange bubble. But there are other people who exist now in a way that they didn't exist a quarter century ago because the rules have changed. The rules from on high.
Susan.
Yeah, I want to push, someone's got to play devil's advocate.
Please.
I want to push back a little. I mean, with all due respect, you may have a very thick skin and you may not have minded being called kite, but I could understand a black student if all the white students in the class every time he came in said, hey, there's the nigger. Or if I, as the only woman student in the class, had, got catcalls, here comes the hoe, there comes the hoe. I mean, there are certain standards of civility at the university, and among them is that we don't make our fellow students and colleagues needlessly, uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So, and Title IX presumably was designed to sort of get at that. I'm not defending.
Well, Title IX, of course, was designed for something else and is now,
right.
but yes.
But without going to the current extreme, I want to say that let's sort of admit perhaps a reasonable standard of civility, that free speech doesn't mean you can just scream you hoe at every woman in the room. And so that would be one point. The second point is that gender, I mean, the way we use gender now is not the only way that, the original way, at least, when you study language, as you know, you talk about the gender of the noun.
Yes.
I didn't mean that just facetiously.
Sure.
So in some sense, maybe long ago in England, people thought that ships were female.
Yes.
There was a kind of poetic identification of certain kinds of objects which have nothing to do with sexual reproduction.
It's true.
With the feminine sphere. And that's fine.
Right.
I mean, so that would be one thing. That it's the way, it's an old story that pronouns can have gender associations that have nothing directly to do with biological sex.
Right.
The second thing was, you yourself referred to the fact that, that we used to use thou and thee, and now we don't. But there was probably a transitional period where to use the wrong pronoun was an act of disrespect. If you called an employee, if you 2A an employee in France, that's can be an act of disrespect.
Yes.
And under those conditions, it is a kind of rudeness. And so it's simply not a grammatical point, because when you use which pronoun can also be in flux. So I want to suggest that the current problem is really about kind of ideology of that sort of makes a certain kind of sexual fluidity a hugely big deal. And getting it right will, if you don't, it destroys lives and so on. And that's certainly an arguable point. I happen to disagree that I think it's way overblown. But isn't that the real issue, the attempt to turn using the wrong pronouns into the equivalent of using tu when you should be saying vous in French?
Right. So in fact, you'll be glad to know that I agree more or less, and probably much more than less, with every single thing you just said. So let me start. The middle one was a little different from the other two. That's about ships and so on. You're of course right, and that's not just an old thing. If you break a champagne bottle against a ship today and christen it, I mean, this is not something that people in my milieu do, but I gather you use feminine pronouns, and for better or for worse. Some people think for worse, maybe so. Lots of guys call their cars her. Ships and cars, are both sort of round and spherical, and well, okay. But of course, it's not about sexual reproduction, as you say. So yes, we could certainly talk more about that, but you're correct that at least on the margins of English today, there are some uses of gendered pronouns that don't have to do with sexual reproduction and are a little bit odd in the wider perspective, but are still very much in the language. Absolutely. Okay. The other 2 points are, I think, really great, and we just have to hash these things out. So first of all, I'm interested in now what you're going to say about this. if I call you, is there a difference between my calling you, sorry to do this, a hoe once, and my deciding that every single time I see you, I'm going to say, yo, ho, or something like that, right? I mean, where is the line here? I am all for civility, and I just don't know. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know where one is supposed to draw that line and how one is supposed to draw the line between accidental versus non-accidental. I mean, in the case of ho, it's hard to imagine it being non-accidental, but one can imagine other cases where it might be. And then the difference between doing it once because one is drunk or one is angry or who knows, or one is trying to be funny and the other person doesn't regard it as funny. Where's the line between that and doing it very, very often? Where's the line here between illegality and incivility, to put it like that? And that's, I think, for everybody to discuss. Last but not least, the transitional point. Yes, I'm really, really glad you mentioned this. It is absolutely the case that the way language works, always, is, in this sense, gradual. It's not that people wake up one day and, you know, the day before you said X and now nobody does. The way it works is that more and more people start doing something, pronouncing a word in a given way, using a word with an expanded sense, adding a word to the vocabulary, subtracting a word. That's the way it goes. And so, sure, there has to be that intermediate period. How does one make laws? Again, I'm not a lawyer. How does one make laws about language to deal with this sort of thing? I don't know. I'm glad I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how to do it. What I do believe is that as far as gender is concerned at the moment, it's not that we're in a transition where everybody can see what's going to happen. That's what worries me. It's not that I believe firmly that the word gender is going to make it, and that at some point there's going to be a reasonably robust understanding of gender, whether I or you or somebody else likes it or not, that one can more or less create laws on. But we're absolutely not at that period right now as far as this thing is concerned. But yes, it's because we're in transition, but this is a particularly messy transition. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to all this, but I actually agree with everything you said. Thank you.
I can put some clarity on.
I'm sure you can.
For you.
You're a lawyer.
The law takes in, if a employee called a boss a kike, that would probably be a non-offense. But if the employer called the employee a kike, that would be, and that's because the law takes into account power relationships. And there are certain things an employer can't say to an employee, whereas an employee can say, may say, to an employer. So that explains a lot of this, the law, I think.
Right. It doesn't explain, though, what happens if one student calls another student a hoe or a kike.
Correct. Well, you know, my solution would be, if you called something repeatedly that you don't like, ignore it and say to the person, until you address me the way I want to be addressed, I'm not going to answer your question.
Right. So I'm this wishy-washy kind of guy by nature who agrees with that and agrees with you that this is seriously uncivil. Ultimately, I suppose, I love being on camera for this, ultimately, I incline in your direction because I don't actually like making things that are tricky like this illegal. But it's not that I don't understand the impulse. I absolutely do. This is my usual wishy-washy sort of way.
Harvey.
I'd
Harvey
like to
Nelson.
know how many people are in this category, not the ones who are supporting this categorization, but the percentage of the population, the U.S. population, that are in this, the long list of LGBTQ and all the rest.
Right.
Do you happen to know that?
I don't, but what I can say is that the percentage is astronomically higher on Twitter than it is in the real world. But that, I mean, I know I didn't say that to be funny. I mean, this is a question in which social media is running a majority minority on social media is wreaking havoc on the rest of the population, most of which, you know, couldn't care less about any of this.
There's a tail and dog problem here, I think. Some comments on what's been said. With regard to the gender assignment of inanimate objects, to my knowledge, they're all female. Ships, planes, tanks,
Yep.
even the planet. It's Mother Earth, it's never Father Earth or Parent Earth. So, you know.
It's
Well-
father-son.
What?
No, it's often father-son. No, I mean, male-female runs different
S-U-N,
ways.
father, son?
Yeah.
I've never heard that, okay.
Yeah.
You get one. It strikes me that this is an outgrowth of what has emerged in society here over the last 2 decades, and that's what might be called victimology, the ascendancy of victimization as a credential for what you want to accomplish. And we see it now rampant in groups. In fact, all groups now are preferred except for white males, and even they're absolute white heterosexual males. And we've seen this being played on, and that's what you get, I think, on the college campus. I've been victimized, he called me a name I didn't like, I want action. There's a communitarian sense to that, and I say this as a libertarian who usually believes in just individual rights. But as a society, we of necessity draw lines in the gray. So for example, we say that you can vote at 18. I suppose some 17-year-old could bring a lawsuit saying, I'm perfectly capable, I'm as mature, and I know a 19-year-old here who you really shouldn't have at the ballot box. But we make the arbitrary distinction because we have to draw a line somewhere and then let those who can get on with it. If a 5-year-old child wanders into traffic in the street, you'll go and physically grab the child and bring her back. You try that with a 25-year-old female and you've got yourself some problems. There are lines.
If you try with the 25-year-old male, you're also going to have problems, by the way. Yes.
So there are lines that we draw. And I suspect that what's happened here is we haven't been willing to draw a line in the gray. Frankly, I guess I agree with Harvey, and I don't know why the government's getting into this. As for this question of somebody always referring to someone as a hoe, okay, in a situation like that, I suppose you could go to the dean and say, X here is harassing me, and you would make a judgment on the case. But it doesn't have to be codified. And it doesn't have to be the first time somebody says something, and you immediately run to a dean of diversity who now is going to expel somebody or other to show that he's worth his job. And I wonder if we can get to that point where we just, in effect, are willing to say, okay, there are a handful of you who have all sorts of problems with gender. I will sympathize with you because we all have personal problems of some kind or other. But the community is making the assessment that if you want to walk around without clothes, well, it's an individual statement, but you can't do it. We can assign the community has a different value. And we can assign a community value here to gender or sex, duality, if you want to call it that. And for those of you who have trouble with that, we're sorry, but you're simply going to have to make accommodation to society as a whole. And as I say, let those who can get on with it. I'm reminded, in closing, I think William F. Buckley said at the time when New York was going to allow everybody to be admitted to college, he said, let's give everybody a PhD at birth and let those who can get on with it.
Yep.
And I think we need something of that type right here.
Right. Well, there's much I could say. I'll comment only on one point that you made where I mildly disagree, and that's the matter of precedent. So I, as I think I'm making clear, do not like the imposition from on high of laws about speech and about contentious speech in particular. But you seem to say, well, if somebody says ho to you too many times, then okay, there isn't some federal mandate that you can't do that, but you go to the dean and the dean will look at it in context and not codify whatever the punishment or non-punishment is. And that worries me because of precedent. It's one thing to say that you shouldn't have a law from on high about this, but if you have a local, call it law, if you have a local ruling, then it seems to me very bad news if then the next week somebody else comes in and there's no record whatsoever of what happened. That just seems to me wrong. So there's a difference here between law and local custom, but I do think that local custom has to be recorded in some way as well, because it would be grossly unfair to punish X for saying ho, 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 ho. That comes out wrong, but you know what I mean. And then the next week, person Y. Other than that, yes, I mean, victimology, sure, we could talk for hours about this.
And I was thinking when you go to the dean would call the guy and say, knock it off. And that would be, it wasn't talking about expelling the student or disciplining.
Right, that's what used to happen.
Right.
Yeah, right. And I think we should.
The phrase knock it off is excellent. I strongly encourage more knock it offism. But that's not going to happen very easily.
This is not quite a
Those were
question.
two. You next. Go ahead. That's all right.
This is not quite a question, but talking about the question of power of some people over other people. My wife, who's turning 70, on her birth certificate says baby girl because the nurse didn't like the name that my mother-in-law gave her.
Unbelievable.
My wife's name is Kerry, Kerry, and the nurse said that's a boy's name. I mean, so, you know, it seems a little crazy. The other crazy thing is I worked at Boston University, and there was an employee whose first name is Dean. Now, just imagine what that does in academia.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not as good as cardinal sin of the Philippines, but it's pretty good. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, birth certificates have become very interesting because right. But now there are many moves to amend birth certificates. That's actually intellectually a very interesting thing. Now, your wife's case might be a really good case of doing this, since presumably she doesn't go by the name baby girl. Right. Right. Although one can imagine all sorts of stories to follow from that. But in general, I do think it's quite interesting that legal documents like this, that there are moves now to be able regularly to amend them by personal choice.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Bush, and thanks for your circumstantial and explicit lecture. And first of all, I want to have an answer for Professor Mansfield's question. That was the difference between the pronouns and the nouns. I guess that the appearance of the pronouns do help us to see more things in one sentence. So we could use one simple sentence to contains more meaning. So I think the appearance of pronouns do help us to enhance the ability to abstract. So I think it might be a symbol of human being become more reasonable, become more rational. So that's the answer I want to say to Professor Mansfield.
I would say, yeah, actually that's quite interesting. I would add to that you're quite right that pronouns can give you information that was not there to begin with. There are languages in which that kind of information is going to be substantially greater than what you get in English. But I mean, let's take a name like, let's take Carrie, which I guess can be both male and female. So if you say, well, Carrie went to the store, Carrie looked at the time, Carrie went home again, and then you compare that with Carrie went to the store, he or she, then you actually are given a piece of information that you didn't have there in the first place. So that's a nice observation.
Yeah, sorry, I have one more comment for
Sure.
Professor Zhuzhe. I'm a student who study philosophy, so when I first touched your title of your lecture, I want to, I have a thought that, we people have so many different ideas and opinions about our gender. But it do, increase the different ways of kind of self-expression, not just limited male and female. But I have a question that, does this, abundance or varieties of self-expression give us more? I mean, in the old times, when we see female, it might imply you're soft or weak or, some very gentle features. And when we see the male, it implies you're strong or with many muscles. But today, we do have, if one person is biological female, but she said, I am in social gender, I'm male. So at this point, when we see female, the first thing is that we should pay attention to that. We can't see that she is weak. So at this point, it seems like female and male, such kind of words, reduce their meaning. Their meaning become more limited.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, my question is that, so this kind of so-called abundance of self-expression bring us what? I mean, more. We do have the liberty to express ourselves, but it seems this kind of abundance of self-expression is quite thin and quite limited. Just some features, isolated features together add to describe one person. So I just questioned this kind of abundance of self-expression. I do think it helps some people to, to say what kind of person he or she is. But in my opinion, I think this kind of self-expression might be a question of your self-awareness. Because you can't use the traditional male or female to define what kind of person you are, but you use some isolated features to define you. But are you successfully use these isolated features to define you? So I think it might be a crisis of your self-awareness.
Yeah. I feel as though I should punt this question to Professor Mansfield, who has never been called Professor Womansfield, because after all, Professor Mansfield knows more than anybody else here about the distinction, I'm being serious here, between masculine on the one hand and manly on the other, or feminine and womanly. I'm going to give that one to you.
As you spoke, I was thinking of another point, which is the way in which Chinese, when they come to our country, take a proper name that we can pronounce. So this is Jiaxin, Li Jiaxin. Yeah. And she calls herself Veronica. So
Indeed. I mean, actually, this is a very good point, because this seems to be very widely culturally accepted in a way that perhaps with the Bangladeshi blockbuster employee, it was not. It's actually a very good point. I hadn't thought about that, and I would be very interested. I'm now not answering your comment at all, for which I apologize, but I'd be very interested actually to know what you think about this, what one might call double system of naming, which is so incredibly common as Harvey just said, in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, in particular with people from China.
You mean
There's your name, and then there's what you call yourself or allow me to call you here. I mean, there's a cultural allowance of this that we don't have in the same way, I think it's fair to say, with any other culture. I mean, there are isolated cases, but I think it's fair to say that there is specifically a Sino-American culture of doing this, for better or for worse. Yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a from an individual perspective, if you're grow up in one of the metropolis, you'll have English class in your first grade, and then your first grade English teacher will assign you an English name, more or less randomly. Wow. Or sometimes if your parents know English, I mean, in my generation that's really, really rare. Maybe your parents have given you an English name. It's more or less unrelated to your Chinese name. Although I do have a friend in first grade whose surname is Shi, which means stone, and his English name is Peter. That was but generally...
Is he Catholic?
I don't think he is.
Ah,
I don't
okay.
think he is, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Might still become Pope, rooting for him, but...
that was not what I meant, but all right, yes.
So societally, this is very kind of a professional usage as well. I think a lot of companies have this convention of referring to colleagues by English names. Like everyone speaks Chinese. Many times these people themselves don't really speak English, but they'll call each other by, Mark, Vivian, Daisy, or whatever, as a kind of, I'm not sure why exactly, but I think has to do with a kind of attitude, sort of, we're a global company and we want to have a 21st century mindset. We want to sort of, be in step with the times. So it has that kind of associational reasons. That's my take on it.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah, Anna.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
All right, let me get back. So, what about language changes? And you said, Professor Katz, if I understood, that language changes tend to be slow. And yet I wonder, aren't there two kinds of language changes? Maybe I misunderstood, but it seems like there's fast and slow, and it probably largely correlates with top-down versus bottom-up, which is to say with coerced or free. In July 1917, Russians were all calling each other Mr. and Miss, and Russian thereof.
Right.
And then
Yes.
a year later, they're all calling each other comrade. And,
Right.
You had to do that.
Right.
Which also, in that way, it was the recent changes obviously have this coerced top-down, quick quality.
Yes. Right. Okay. Good. So I didn't mean to say that language change is either fast or slow. Simply that it is never instantaneous. There are certain languages that at certain times have in certain ways changed very quickly, and certain languages at certain times that have changed incredibly slowly. The Irish language changed massively in the course of a couple hundred years in the first half of the first millennium AD. The Icelandic language has changed very minimally over the past 1,000, not very minimally, but comparatively very minimally. One of the issues here has to do with what one might call imposition of vocabulary as opposed to more, I hate to use this word, but systemic or systematic changes. So the processes by which a new word or a new designation, comrade, that sort of thing, gets introduced is quite different from the sort of thing whereby sounds, well, let's say, then in which sounds change, which then tends to run language change much more broadly. So yes, you absolutely can very quickly get a word imposed, often from a top-down perspective, or have some word removed, again, often from a top-down perspective because it now has unsavory connotations. But even then, of course, it isn't instantaneous, right? What does it mean? It's instantaneous for one person to do it, but it has to spread like waves throughout society, and it takes some time. But sure, you can introduce a word like comrade, or remove a word like master much more quickly than you can do certain things that are not just single items of vocabulary or items within some very specific sphere, but affect the language as a whole.
I think it's,
No,
no,
we have
one last,
No, we have Paul.
one last question.
No,
Who?
looking over.
Oh, Paul, okay.
We have several.
Well, I was saving this for the end because,
Uh-oh.
but what gender is God?
Well, I mean, I'm an even worse theologian than I am a philosopher. At the top of page 1 of your handout, you will see, because I'm at Harvard, that I made reference to the so-called pronoun envy controversy at Harvard in 1971. Harvey Cox at the Divinity School had some of his students, this was of the time, decide not to call God he, and this actually for a while made national news. What exactly do you want me to say about that or other things? I mean,
the minister at my church refuses to take a position on this. You know, he says,
meaning,
God is referred to as God repeatedly, endlessly.
oh, I see. Yes.
Ruthlessly.
This is like, so this is the, you don't use pronouns because you just say.
The Islamic phrase, God is great.
Yes.
God is great.
Yeah.
But you never hear that he is great. He's always,
Yeah.
God is great. So
Right. Well, so it will be known to many of you in this room that there are now a number of ways of dealing with this. One is just to say God over and over and over again. Some stick to he, some have she, some have they, and some go back and forth, which is actually what I thought you meant. I have heard, well, in one way or another, I have heard all of these in my life. The one that I find actually the most disorienting is the one in which it moves back and forth, so that one sentence is he and the next sentence is she and the next sentence conceivably is they. I find that very disorienting, but other people apparently find this comforting. If you're asking me theologically, well, I don't want to get into my theological thoughts about this. But it is true that one of the areas in which people get particularly exercised about this matter that does not have to do with their own person is in fact the matter of God. And so I'm glad you brought that up. But have a look at the Harvey Cox pronoun envy controversy of 71.
You can see this is one of the reasons why there's growing support in the blue collar area for Donald Trump. It's issues like this.
Like God's pronoun?
Or pronouns in general. That's correct. But that's why a few years ago, if I said I was interested in pronouns, people thought it's funny, and now they don't think it's funny at all. But honestly, this is in my view here, this is a really, really crazy thing for us to be putting near the top of our list of things to worry about. And in a way, maybe I shouldn't even be talking about this because I'm promoting this insanity. But the fact is that people are worried about this rather than, say, the economy. That's nuts.
Wasn't it Gloria Steinem who was doing a demonstration said to the women demonstrating, pray to God, she'll help us?
It sounds plausible. I don't know that, but it sounds plausible. There you go. Did it help?
One last.
Well, one quick comment on Paul, and then I have another pronoun question, but, so Moses Maimonides, if he's an authority for you in the guide, he just absolutely dismisses Christianity because it's demonstratively provable that God is incorporeal and has no attributes, and the Trinity, and he just doesn't even deal with Christianity because he finds it so obviously outrageously foolish. So he would say that question, he obviously has not a body and hence not a penis or no gender or sex. But that's Maimonides, that's not.
He probably didn't approve of Jupiter either.
What?
He probably didn't approve of Jupiter.
No, he didn't. It's the same thing, it's the same thing. So I have a question, I have a friend, a good friend, who said, well, I'm gonna say they if they want that, but I might say they has left the room instead of they have. Would that be a nounification of a pronoun? Would that be a total, misuse of the language, or would that actually introduce a new pronoun category?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and I don't have an easy answer to that. But when I made the comment, bottom of page 9, remember Professor Bugg at Southern Utah University, who felt that plural pronouns were grammatically incorrect. I'm more sympathetic, and I'd have to think carefully about just how I would justify this, but I'm willing to say now as a gambit that I am more sympathetic to that point of view when it's a they was rather than it's a they were. I don't know how far, somebody could get at me now and force me to justify that further, but to me, they was, though actually potentially very useful, is a step too far. I'm not happy about the they to begin with, but I can live with that in various ways for civility. They was would be very, very, very hard for me to do, and I actually think would be very hard for most people to pull off consistently. People who are skeptical of this, or even people who aren't skeptical but are just trying, already find this difficult. That would be creating a second level of difficulty, which would, in some sense, help grammatically, but I think would so mess things up in a way. So I'm not enthusiastic about that, but I think it's a very interesting thing to think about.
Well, it's 2 or a little past 2, and you took a vacation from the recondite and entered the realm of where everyone has an opinion.
Indeed.
And we thank you very much for it. You did it wonderfully well.
Thank you for having me.